Greetings and welcome to the corner, that is TC's Gaming Corner. This is my fifth and final video in my tutorial series on the GMT air combat game Red Storm. My focus is teaching new or prospective players the basics of the game. Now Red Storm has an intimidating 60-page rulebook and I hope to help players get through it. In the first video I taught the basics of air unit movement and activations. In the second video I taught you about aircraft detection and air combat. In the third video I taught you about SAMs, AAA, and jamming. The fourth video was about bombing. And now that I've taught you how to fly and detect and fight the planes, I'm going to teach you about the most important part, the planning. Because to me in this game, half of the battle is the plan. Now I could always quote Eisenhower or Patton or Sun Tzu about planning, but the truth is in Red Storm, the planning really is half the battle. And understanding the game's strict rules on planning a raid is key to playing the game correctly. The typical scenario in Red Storm involves one side being assigned randomly one or more enemy targets. That side is the raiding side. Now the first phase in scenario setup is the ground planning phase. This is where both players determine map locations for SAMs, for dummy SAMs, dummy radars, AAA, etc. On the tabletop you record their locations on log sheets, but on the Vassal version you can use hidden or invisible counters. And your opponent will not see these. Now the scenario rules or a role on the ISR table during setup will specify how many of your SAMs, AAA, and ground forces have to set up located. Once both players have completed the ground planning phase and gotten at least an incomplete picture of the enemy forces, each player conducts their raid planning. Now the first thing is that the raiding player selects the raid targets by following the instructions in the scenario to determine the target or targets for the raid. It's usually done with a die roll, and then those are the targets, of course not known by your opponent. Once the raid targets are set, each side rolls for their order of battle. And after your order of battle is set, you also have to select the ordnance for aircraft with bombing or similar roles, or such as seed flights that will carry air-to-ground ordnance. And then finally is the hardest part, actually planning out the raid. Now the scenario rules or the order of battle will tell you what task each flight has. Now the tasks are important as it dictates much of the behavior, including the route, the types of targets a flight can attack, and when it can engage in air-to-air combat. Now the most common tasks are bombing, seed, which is suppression of enemy air defenses, think wild weasels, cap, combat air patrol, and close escort. There are lots of other tasks and missions in the rulebook, but these are the most common and most important. For instance, you could have two flights of Sukhoi 17s on a bombing task. They could have MiG-27s on a seed task to knock out the enemy SAMs. You could have a couple Sukhoi 27s on cap, combat air patrol or a fighter sweep. And then you could have a couple MiG-21s on close escort following along closely and near the bombers. Importantly, flights tasked with bombing, recon, or transport must follow a path that you set during the planning phase. The flight path can contain up to 8 waypoints. It starts at an ingress hex. For instance, this could be our ingress hex. And ends at the egress hex. So for instance, this could be the egress hex. All flight paths in the same raid must follow the same ingress, release point, and rejoin point, and egress hex. However, the flights can follow different paths from the release point to the rejoin point. This portion must pass close enough to the target hex for it to be attacked. The release and rejoin points must be within 15 hexes of the target hex. So here's another example of a set of waypoints. This could be the ingress hex. This could be a waypoint. The release point for an attack on both the Hawk and the airfield at Schweinfurt, the rejoin point, and then the egress hex. Now when flying along this route, the flights must fly directly from waypoint to waypoint. They must remain within 2 hexes of a line connecting the waypoints, and can start flying to the next waypoint when within 2 hexes of the current waypoint. So for instance, he could fly along here. Once he is within 2 hexes of this waypoint, he can turn towards the next waypoint and fly. And then he's within 2 hexes of his release point. He is now released. He is free to fly, provided that he conducts his attack. Again, they fly the same route, basically, at least the same waypoints. But then when they get to the release point, they are released to fly if they have separate targets, as in this raid. I'm assuming that this flight is attacking Pigtown, or Pigford, Schweinfurt, and we have the 2 attacks there. Now within 3 hexes of the target, the flights can move freely. So for instance, if there was an unknown Vulcan that became detected during the battle, this Sukhoi flight, 17 flight, the Sukhoi 17 flight could, within 3 hexes of the target, could fly freely so as to try to avoid or at least minimize his time near the Vulcan, and then attack. Now most other flights can move freely during a mission. Your cap flight can move freely the whole time. Your seed flights can move freely. So for instance, you could have the cap flight already swept up here, defending against, say, some incoming F-15s. Your seed flight down here, trying to take out the Patriot battery. Well, he can't be there, he can be there. Now the other big exception are close escort flights. They must stay within 6 hexes at all times of the escorted bombers. So if we had MiG-21s here, they would need to stay within 6 hexes of the bombers. They could not be out here sweeping on a cap flight the way the Sukhoi 27s are. This way you got your bombers coming in. Your close escort flights, they are close escort, so it's close to them. And this down here was supposed to be MiG-27s on the seed flight. MiG-21s on the close escort, and your Sukhoi 27. So for instance, you could have your flight doing something like this. Your bombers have to follow roughly waypoint to waypoint, waypoint to waypoint, and then they're released. So they're following this route. Your seed flights can be up ahead, trying to take out, say, this Patriot battery, and then your cap flights up here on the big sweep, trying to keep enemy interceptors away from the bombers. Now those are the basics of planning, raid planning. I didn't get into the details of setting up your hidden and dummy SAM units, hidden and dummy radars, AAA, etc. Just follow the instructions in the book. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and I hope it's helped you learn and understand Red Storm a little bit better. Again, it's a thick rule book. There are a lot of rules in there. There are a lot of exceptions to these rules or more specific applications. I recommend you using the rule book liberally while playing the game, especially the first few times, to understand all the little nuances in the game. But modern air combat, and by modern I'm thinking the 1980s, is very complex, and this game mirrors those complexities with many of its specific and nuanced rules. But I hope these 5 tutorials have given you a good flavor and a good feel of the basics of the game. Enjoy it, happy hunting, and thank you for tuning in to TC's Gaming Corner.